In the first week of October 1939, Gottlob Herbert Bidermann stepped off a train at a military depot outside Stuttgart and inhaled the smell that would define the next 6 years of his life: boot polish, rifle oil, and the sharp chemical tang of cleaning solvent. He was 18 years old, a former apprentice locksmith whose hands were calloused from metalwork, and he carried a small bag containing everything he had been permitted to bring from home. The platform was crowded with young men his age, most of them silent, watching as Feldwebels in immaculate uniforms began sorting them into groups with the efficiency of factory foremen organizing a shift change. Biedermann had volunteered for the Wehrmacht 3 months earlier, driven by reasons he would later struggle to articulate. Patriotism, certainly, but also the sense that history was accelerating and he did not want to be left behind. Poland had fallen in 27 days. The newspapers spoke of a new kind of warfare, fast and decisive, and Biedermann wanted to understand how it worked. Infantry Replacement Battalion 132 occupied a complex of brick buildings that had trained soldiers since the Kaiser's time. The barracks smelled of disinfectant and woolen blankets that had never fully dried. Biedermann was assigned a bunk, a locker, and a number, and within hours he had learned the first lesson of German military training. Nothing would be given to him that he had not earned through demonstrated competence. The Unteroffiziers who ran the training program were professionals, most of them veterans of the Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army that the Treaty of Versailles had permitted Germany to maintain after the last war. These men had spent the interwar years perfecting techniques that would have seemed exotic in any other army. They believed that every soldier, regardless of rank, should be capable of independent tactical judgment. They believed that realistic training saved lives, and they believed, with an intensity that bordered on religious conviction, that the German infantryman was the finest soldier in the world, but only if he was properly forged. The program Biedermann entered was scheduled to last 16 weeks, in an era when most armies considered 8 weeks sufficient for basic infantry training. The Wehrmacht devoted twice that time to transforming civilians into soldiers. The curriculum was exhaustive. Biedermann learned to disassemble and reassemble his Karabiner 98K rifle blindfolded, a skill tested in total darkness at 3 in the morning, while instructors shouted conflicting orders designed to simulate the confusion of combat. He learned to navigate by compass and stars, to estimate distances without instruments, to identify the sounds of different weapons by their report alone. He crawled through mud under live machine gun fire that passed 18 inches above his back, close enough that he could feel the pressure waves disturbing the air. The Unteroffiziers explained calmly that men who kept their heads down survived, and men who panicked died, and that the purpose of this exercise was to teach his body the difference before his mind had time to interfere. What distinguished German training from its counterparts in other armies was not brutality, though it was certainly demanding, but rather its systematic emphasis on initiative. Biedermann was taught to think. When an exercise went wrong, instructors did not simply correct the error. They demanded that each soldier analyze what had happened and propose alternatives. Junior enlisted men were expected to understand not just their own roles, but the roles of everyone around them, so that if an NCO fell, the mission could continue without pause. This philosophy had a name: Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. A commander issued objectives, not detailed instructions. The men executing the mission were trusted to determine how best to achieve those objectives based on conditions they could observe, but their superiors could not. It was a revolutionary concept, born from Germany's recognition after 1918 that it could never match its enemies in raw numbers, and therefore had to multiply the effectiveness of every individual soldier. Biedermann did not know, as he learned to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements, that he was being shaped by a system that would not survive the war it was designed to win. The system that shaped him had been born from humiliation. In November 1918, the German Empire collapsed, its armies undefeated in the field, but broken by blockade, exhaustion, and revolution at home. The Treaty of Versailles, signed the following summer, imposed restrictions designed to prevent Germany from ever waging aggressive war again. The army was limited to 100,000 men. Conscription was forbidden. The general staff was dissolved. Tanks, military aircraft, and heavy artillery were prohibited. The victoring powers believed they had defanged a predator. They had, instead, created the conditions for something far more dangerous, an army with nothing to do but think. The Reichswehr that emerged from these restrictions was unlike any army in history. Unable to rely on mass, its commanders became obsessed with quality. Every enlisted man was selected from hundreds of applicants and trained to perform the duties of the rank above him. Corporals learned to lead platoons. Sergeants studied battalion tactics. The prohibition on a general staff was circumvented by disguising it as a troop office, staffed by officers who spent their days analyzing the last war and planning for the next. They studied the Western Front's stalemate with clinical detachment, searching for the breakthrough that had eluded both sides. They found it not in new weapons, but in new methods: decentralized command, combined arms coordination, speed as a weapon in itself. The army that could not legally exist on paper was reinventing warfare in basement offices across Berlin. Friedrich Fromm observed this transformation from a position of quiet authority. Born in 1918, the son of a Protestant civil servant, Fromm had served as an artillery officer in the last war and emerged with a reputation for administrative competence rather than battlefield heroism. He was tall, heavy-set, with a face that seemed permanently fixed in an expression of cautious calculation. By 1939, at the age of 51, he commanded the Ersatzheer, the replacement army, a position that made him responsible for every soldier Germany trained, every depot that equipped them, and every battalion that fed them into the front lines. His office in the Bendler Block, the military headquarters on Bendlerstrasse in Berlin, smelled of cigarette smoke and paper files. Maps covered the walls. Telephones rang constantly. Fromm controlled an empire of training camps, administrative districts, and personnel records, and he understood, better than most generals, that modern war was won not by brilliant tactics, but by the relentless mathematics of men and materiel. The irony of Germany's position in 1939 would not become apparent until much later. The Versailles Treaty, intended to cripple German military power, had instead forced a generation of officers to master the art of doing more with less. The small Reichswehr became a laboratory for military innovation. Its NCO corps, the Unteroffiziers who would train men like Bidermann, were the finest in the world precisely because they had been selected and developed with obsessive care during 20 years of enforced limitation. When Hitler began rearmament in 1935, this cadre of professionals provided the skeleton around which a mass army could grow. The 100,000 became 500,000, then 1,000,000, then more. Each original Reichswehr soldier became an instructor, passing on skills honed during the long years of restriction. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland was not large by the standards of the last war, but it was extraordinarily well trained, and its junior leaders possessed an independence of judgment that bewildered opponents accustomed to rigid hierarchies. Fromm understood that this advantage was a wasting asset. The Reichswehr's professionals were not infinitely divisible. Every expansion diluted the ratio of experienced trainers to raw recruits. Every battle that killed a senior NCO removed someone who could not be replaced by any amount of money or political will. The training system that had taken 20 years to build could be consumed in a single campaign if casualties exceeded the rate at which new instructors could be developed. In September 1939, as victory reports arrived from Poland, Fromm's staff was already calculating how long the machine could run before it began to devour itself. Biedermann's body learned before his mind could catch up. By the 6th week of training, he could estimate the range to a target within 50 meters at distances up to 800 meters, a skill drilled into him through thousands of repetitions until it became instinct rather than calculation. His instructors used a method they called Entfernungsschätzen, distance estimation, that required recruits to guess ranges, then pace them off on foot to verify their errors. The men who guessed poorly did the exercise again and again. The November rains turned the training grounds into a landscape of mud that sucked at boots and soaked through every layer of wool, but the exercises continued regardless. An Unteroffizier with 17 years of service explained, without sympathy, that enemy soldiers would not wait for favorable weather, and neither would the Wehrmacht. The night navigation exercises began in week 8. Biedermann was handed a compass, a map, and a set of coordinates, then released into unfamiliar terrain in total darkness. He had 4 hours to reach his objective. The first time, he failed, wandering in circles until dawn revealed he had passed within 200 meters of his target without recognizing it. The failure burned. He studied the maps more carefully, learned to count his paces, trained himself to feel the slope of the ground through his boots. By the 3rd attempt, he completed the course with 40 minutes to spare. The Unteroffizier, who checked his time, said nothing, but nodded once, the highest praise Biedermann would receive during his entire training period. What surprised him most was how much thinking was required. He had expected military training to be about obedience, about learning to follow orders without question. Instead, his instructors constantly demanded judgment. During tactical exercises, squad leaders were killed without warning. An instructor would tap a man on the shoulder and declare him dead, and whoever was nearest had to assume command immediately. There was no time to request guidance. Decisions had to be made with incomplete information, under pressure, with consequences for failure. Biedermann watched friends make mistakes that would have been fatal in combat, advancing without suppressive fire, bunching up in the open, failing to designate fields of fire. The instructors dissected each error methodically, not with anger, but with the cold precision of surgeons examining a wound. The goal was not punishment, but education. Dead soldiers could not learn from their mistakes. The training ground existed to make those mistakes survivable. In February 1940, Biedermann completed his 16 weeks and received orders assigning him to the 132nd Infantry Division. He was now a Gefreiter, a lance corporal, with a paybook, a rifle, and the knowledge that he was as prepared as any soldier in the world. The division moved west, toward the French border, and waited. The newspapers called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. France and Britain had declared war after Poland, but done little since. Biedermann's unit dug defensive positions and practiced the same drills they had learned in training. The men grew restless. Some wondered if the war might end without another shot being fired. It did not. On May 10, 1940, the Wehrmacht attacked. Biedermann's division was not part of the initial assault, the famous thrust through the Ardennes that would unhinge the entire Allied defensive plan. But within days, his unit was moving, and it did not stop for 6 weeks. The training system proved itself in the chaos of mobile warfare. When officers fell, NCOs took command. When NCOs fell, enlisted men like Biedermann made decisions that kept their squads alive and advancing. The French army, larger and equipped with more tanks, crumbled not from lack of courage, but from lack of speed. Its commanders waited for orders that arrived too late. Its soldiers fought bravely in positions that had already been bypassed. By June 22, France had surrendered. The Wehrmacht had lost approximately 27,000 dead in 6 weeks of fighting, a fraction of what the last war had cost for far less gain. Fromm's office in Berlin received the casualty reports with satisfaction tempered by arithmetic. The losses were sustainable. The training system could replace 27,000 men. The question was what would happen when the numbers grew larger. The numbers grew larger on June 22, 1941. At 3:15 in the morning, along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. Bidermann was among them. His division advanced through landscapes that seemed to have no end, forests that swallowed entire regiments, plains where the horizon offered no reference point, roads that turned to soup after the briefest rain. The smell of the Soviet Union was different from France. Wood smoke, black earth, something vegetable and ancient that rose from the marshes. The scale was incomprehensible. In France, a day's advance of 40 kilometers was remarkable. Here, 40 kilometers meant nothing. The maps in Bidermann's possession showed villages that no longer existed and roads that had never been paved. His unit marched east, and the east continued receding. The early weeks brought victories that seemed to validate every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about itself. Soviet units disintegrated under the speed of German operations. Entire armies were encircled at Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev. The numbers of prisoners exceeded anything in military history. 324,000 captured at Kiev alone, a figure so large that Bidermann, watching columns of defeated men shuffle westward, could not process it as a quantity of individual human beings. The training system had produced soldiers capable of executing complex maneuvers across impossible distances, and those soldiers were destroying the largest army in the world. By October, German forces stood within sight of Moscow. Victory seemed inevitable. Fromm's office in Berlin told a different story. The replacement requests arriving at the Bendler block had begun as a trickle in July and become a flood by September. The Wehrmacht had entered the Soviet Union with approximately 3.3 million men in the invasion force. By the end of August, it had suffered over 400,000 casualties, dead, wounded, missing, sick. The training depots were emptying faster than they could be refilled. Fromm's staff calculated that the army was consuming trained soldiers at a rate that would exhaust the replacement pipeline within months if losses continued at the current pace. The autumn mud arrived in October, freezing men and machines in place. And then the winter came, and the calculations became catastrophic. The cold that descended on the Eastern Front in November 1941 was not ordinary winter weather. Temperatures dropped to -30°C, then -40. Rifle bolts froze shut. Vehicle engines cracked. Frostbite consumed fingers and toes with the indifference of artillery fire. Bidermann's unit, still wearing the summer uniform in which they had crossed the border 5 months earlier, learned to stuff newspapers beneath their tunics for insulation. The winter equipment existed. Fromm's depots held stockpiles of cold-weather gear, but the logistics system could not deliver it across the vast distances the army had covered. Men died not from enemy action, but from exposure, from disease, from the simple failure of supply lines stretched beyond their capacity. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5th. Fresh divisions from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, struck the frozen German lines outside Moscow. For the first time, the Wehrmacht retreated. Bidermann's division was not in the most desperate sector, but he heard the reports: units overrun, positions abandoned, the myth of German invincibility cracking in the frozen darkness. By the time the front stabilized in early 1942, the Wehrmacht had suffered approximately 830,000 total casualties since June, more than a quarter of the invasion force. The dead alone numbered over 200,000, and among them were sergeants and lieutenants and captains whose knowledge could not be replaced by any training program, no matter how thorough. Fromm understood what these losses meant. Each experienced NCO who froze to death outside Moscow represented years of institutional investment, a man who had been trained to train others, whose judgment had been refined with practice, whose absence would ripple through the system for years. The Reichswehr's professional cadre, the foundation upon which the entire Wehrmacht had been built, was being fed into a furnace. The training system that had produced Bidermann still functioned, but the men who made it exceptional were dying faster than they could pass on what they knew. The replacements arrived in March 1942, and Bidermann knew something was wrong within the first hour. His company had lost 43 men during the winter, some to enemy action, more to frostbite and disease, and the depot had sent 31 new soldiers to fill the gaps. They stepped off the transport trucks with equipment that was still clean, uniforms that had never been patched, and eyes that searched for threats in the wrong places. Bidermann watched one of them struggle to clear a jam from his rifle, fumbling with the bolt in a way that suggested he had performed the action perhaps a dozen times rather than the hundreds required to make it automatic. The man's hands were soft. He had been a clerk in Dusseldorf 4 months earlier. His training had lasted 8 weeks. The 16-week program that had shaped Bidermann no longer existed. Fromm's office had authorized the reduction in October 1941, when the casualty reports made clear that the front could not wait for properly finished soldiers. 12 weeks became the new standard, then 10, then 8 for some specialties. The curriculum was compressed rather than redesigned, the same material delivered faster, with fewer repetitions, less time for skills to become reflexive. The instructors protested through official channels, documenting the specific deficiencies they observed. Recruits who could not estimate ranges accurately, who panicked under simulated fire, who failed basic navigation exercises at rates that would have been unacceptable a year earlier. The protests were acknowledged and filed. The front needed bodies. The bodies were sent. What could not be compressed was experience. The Unteroffiziers who had trained Bidermann possessed judgment refined through years of practice, an intuitive understanding of what soldiers needed to know and how to teach it. These men were now dying in numbers that no administrative adjustment could address. An NCO killed at Vyazma could not be replaced by promoting a corporal and giving him a training manual. The knowledge existed in habits of mind, in the ability to read a recruit's face and understand what he did not yet grasp, in 10,000 small decisions made correctly because they had been made before. This institutional memory was bleeding out of the Wehrmacht, one casualty report at a time, and no order from Berlin could staunch the wound. Bidermann spent the spring of 1942 teaching the new men what their training had failed to provide. He showed them how to dig fighting positions with proper drainage, how to sight a machine gun to cover dead ground, how to move through a forest without silhouetting themselves against the sky. The replacements learned, some of them, but they learned slowly, and the lessons that should have been instinct remained conscious effort. In combat, conscious effort meant hesitation, and hesitation meant death. Bidermann watched 2 of the March replacements die in their first engagement, an ambush that the men of his original training cohort would have recognized and avoided. One of them was the clerk in Dusseldorf. He had been with the company for 11 days. The mathematics were unforgiving. A soldier trained for 16 weeks and tested in realistic exercises arrived at the front with perhaps an 80% chance of surviving his first month in combat. A soldier trained for 8 weeks with instructors who were themselves inexperienced arrived with odds significantly worse. The difference compounded across thousands of men and dozens of engagements. Units that had once absorbed replacements smoothly now found themselves degraded by each new intake, the veterans forced to compensate for skills the newcomers lacked, the overall effectiveness declining even as nominal strength was maintained. The training system was still producing soldiers. It was no longer producing soldiers of the quality that had conquered France. Fromm received reports quantifying the decline, but the reports could not capture what Bidermann saw in the faces of men who knew they were not ready. The replacement system had become a pipeline delivering young Germans to the Eastern Front with just enough training to follow orders and not enough to survive the consequences. The machine was still running. Its output had changed. The problem was not merely losses. The problem was that Germany was fighting itself for the men who remained. Friedrich Fromm sat in meetings throughout 1942, where he watched the Wehrmacht's training capacity dismembered by forces no battlefield commander could see, and no single decision could reverse. The air in the Benderloch conference rooms was thick with cigarette smoke, and the particular tension of men who understood they were presiding over a slow catastrophe. Fromm had the numbers. He had always had the numbers. What he lacked was the authority to make them matter. The Luftwaffe maintained approximately 1.5 million men in ground roles by mid-1942, administrative personnel, airfield guards, construction troops, supply handlers. These were young, healthy Germans who had passed the same physical examinations as infantry recruits, yet they would never see combat as riflemen. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal who commanded the Air Force, refused to transfer them to army control. The Luftwaffe was his empire, and he defended it with the bureaucratic ferocity of a man whose political survival depended on maintaining institutional mass. When the army requested transfers, Göring offered instead to form Luftwaffe field divisions, infantry units trained and commanded by Air Force officers who had never led men in ground combat. The results were predictable. These divisions, thrown into the line at Stalingrad and elsewhere, suffered catastrophic casualties, precisely because their leadership lacked the skills that years of army doctrine had developed. Men died proving that institutional pride was more important than institutional competence. The Waffen-SS presented a different problem. Heinrich Himmler's military formations recruited directly from the civilian population, competing with the Wehrmacht for the same pool of volunteers. The SS offered better equipment, elite status, ideological purpose, and critically, the perception of being assigned to decisive operations, rather than endless defensive attrition. The young men most likely to volunteer for military service, the energetic and physically capable recruits who would have become the next generation of NCOs, increasingly chose the SS over the army. Fromm's replacement depots received what remained: the less enthusiastic, the less fit, the men who had not been selected by organizations with first pick. The training system was being starved of raw material. At the same time, it was being stripped of experienced instructors. The Navy hoarded 700 men for a surface fleet that barely left port, and a submarine service that, while genuinely engaged in combat, could not absorb such numbers. Coastal artillery units, naval infantry formations, shipyard workers in uniform. The Kriegsmarine maintained establishments grotesquely oversized for its actual operational requirements. Fromm requested transfers. The requests disappeared into inter-service negotiations that produced nothing. Each branch of the Wehrmacht defended its institutional personnel allocation as a matter of institutional survival, and no authority existed to override their collective selfishness. Hitler, who could have imposed rationalization, instead encouraged the competition, believing that rivalry produced strength. It produced waste. Bidermann knew nothing of these conferences. He knew only that the replacements kept arriving with less preparation, that the veterans in his company grew fewer each month, and that the war seemed to have no end. The summer of 1942 brought a new offensive in the south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and his division marched again through heat and dust toward objectives that receded like mirages. The men around him were different now. The company he had joined in 1940 possessed a cohesion built from shared training and shared experience. The company he served in by late 1942 was a patchwork of survivors and newcomers who barely knew each other's names before combat separated them permanently. Fromm approved another reduction in training time that autumn. 6 weeks became acceptable for infantry replacements in non-specialized roles. The memoranda authorizing the change used language about streamlined instruction and focused combat preparation, but everyone who signed them understood what they meant. Germany was now sending men to the Eastern Front with less training than a factory worker received before operating dangerous machinery. The machine gun that Bidermann had learned to respect through months of practice would be placed in the hands of men who had fired it perhaps 50 times. The system that had built the world's finest army was consuming itself to feed a war that grew hungrier with each passing season. The summer of 1944 smelled of smoke and desperation. Bidermann, now a Feldwebel himself, promoted through attrition rather than ambition, received a batch of replacements in July that made him question whether the word training still held any meaning. One of them, a 17-year-old from Bavaria, could not field strip his rifle without consulting a printed diagram he kept folded in his pocket. Another had never thrown a live grenade. A third asked Bidermann with genuine confusion how to determine which direction was east when the sun was not visible. These were not stupid men. They were men who had been given 6 weeks to learn what Bidermann had learned in 16, taught by instructors who had themselves never seen combat, using ammunition allocations so reduced that live fire exercises had become luxuries rather than foundations. The system that had built the world's finest army was consuming itself to feed a war that grew hungrier with each passing season. Friedrich Fromm knew the system was failing, and he knew he could not save it. By 1944, the replacement army he commanded had become a shadow organization. Its depots emptied, its instructors transferred to combat units, its administrative machinery grinding forward on institutional momentum rather than genuine capacity. Fromm had spent 5 years watching the Wehrmacht's foundation erode, submitting reports that were acknowledged and ignored, attending conferences where impossible demands were presented as policy. He was 56 years old, tired in ways that did not show on his heavy face, and he had begun to listen to conversations that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. The conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler had been developing for months, and Fromm occupied an agonizing ambiguity within it. The plotters needed him. Operation Valkyrie, the plan to seize control of Germany after Hitler's death, depended on the reserve army that Fromm commanded. The reserve units stationed throughout the Reich would arrest SS and Nazi party leaders, secure communications, and establish military government. Without Fromm's cooperation, the plan could not succeed. But Fromm would not commit. He listened to the conspirators, understood their arguments, recognized the catastrophe toward which Germany was heading, and refused to act until he was certain which side would win. He was a man of numbers, of calculations, of hedged bets. The plotters needed a gambler. They had an accountant. July 20th, 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb beneath a conference table at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia and flew back to Berlin believing the Führer was dead. He was not. The heavy oak table had deflected the blast. Hitler survived with ruptured eardrums and minor wounds, and by evening he was on the telephone, his voice hoarse but unmistakable, ordering the conspiracy crushed. Fromm's moment of decision had arrived, and he made it with the same instinct for self-preservation that had governed his entire career. He arrested the conspirators in his own headquarters, men who had trusted him, who had believed his ambiguous encouragement meant support, and ordered their immediate execution. Stauffenberg died in the courtyard of the Bendler block shortly after midnight, shot by a firing squad organized by the man who had refused to join him. The executions did not save Fromm. Hitler's suspicion fell on everyone connected with the plot, and Fromm's failure to report the conspiracy earlier damned him as thoroughly as participation would have. He was arrested within hours of ordering Stauffenberg's death, removed from command of the replacement army, and held for investigation. The system he had built and watched decay would now decay without him. His replacement, Heinrich Himmler, knew nothing about military training and cared less. The SS chief's appointment was a political statement, not an administrative decision. The replacement army had ceased to be a military organization. It had become another instrument of ideological control in a regime that was consuming itself. Bidermann heard rumors of the assassination attempt, but understood little of its implications. What he understood was that the replacements kept arriving, younger and less prepared with each shipment, and that the front kept demanding more of them. The final winter came, and with it the last reserves of a nation that had exhausted everything except its capacity for self-destruction. In January 1945, the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, received orders to defend the Reich with whatever could be found. Bidermann encountered these units as his division retreated westward through East Prussia, pursued by Soviet forces that no longer needed operational brilliance to achieve victory. The Volkssturm fighters were old men and young boys, some wearing uniforms from the previous war, others in civilian clothes with armbands their only military identification. Many carried weapons manufactured before their fathers were born. Their training lasted days, not weeks. An instructor, often a wounded veteran deemed unfit for combat, had shown them how to load and fire, how to dig a foxhole, how to die in place. That was the extent of their preparation. Bidermann watched a group of them march toward the front, boys of 15 and men of 60 walking together toward a sound like continuous thunder, and he understood that the system which had made him a soldier had finally ceased to exist. Friedrich Fromm did not witness this collapse. He had been held in military detention since July, subjected to investigations that moved with the grinding slowness of bureaucracy, even as the Reich crumbled around them. His trial before the People's Court concluded in early March 1945 with a verdict that surprised no one: guilty of cowardice for failing to act decisively on July 20th in either direction. The execution took place on March 12th at Brandenburg Prison. Fromm faced the firing squad with the composure of a man who had always known that numbers eventually catch up with everyone. He was 56 years old. The army he had spent 5 years trying to sustain outlived him by 8 weeks. The statistics of the training collapse would not be fully calculated until after the war, when Allied intelligence officers sifted through captured documents and interviewed surviving German officers. The 16-week infantry program of 1939 produced soldiers with an estimated 280 hours of tactical instruction. By 1944, replacements received fewer than 90 hours. Live fire exercises, which had consumed 500 rounds per recruit in 1940, were reduced to 75 rounds by 1944. The NCO Corps, which had numbered approximately 100,000 experienced professionals at the war's outset, had suffered over 60,000 dead by war's end, men whose knowledge died with them, whose absence echoed through every replacement battalion that tried and failed to replicate what they had known. Germany did not lose the war because its training system collapsed, but the collapse ensured that the losing would be measured in the bodies of young men who arrived at the front knowing just enough to be afraid and not enough to survive. Gottlob Herbert Bidermann survived. He fought until the final days, was captured by Soviet forces, and spent years in prisoner of war camps before returning to a Germany he barely recognized. He settled in the South, married, raised children, and eventually wrote a memoir that documented what he had witnessed, not as a defense or an apology, but as testimony from a man who had seen a system built to create the world's finest soldiers consume itself in a war that demanded more than any system could provide. He wrote about the replacements who arrived unprepared and died quickly. He wrote about the Unteroffiziers who had trained him and did not survive to train others. He wrote about the mathematics of attrition that no courage could overcome. Bidermann died on February 13, 2014, at age 93. His memoir remains in print, read by historians and veterans and young men trying to understand a war that ended before their grandparents were born. The training system that shaped him, the product of 20 years of forced innovation following a lost war, proved it could build an army capable of conquering a continent. It could not build an army capable of holding that conquest against enemies who learned, adapted, and eventually produced soldiers of their own in numbers that made quality irrelevant. The machine that had forged Bidermann into a soldier was not defeated by a superior machine. It was simply outrun by time, by distance, by the relentless arithmetic of a war that consumed men faster than any system could replace them.